And then things came closer to home, much closer. On October 16, 1943, the Nazis arrested 1,259 Jews in Rome, most of whom were women and children. And since we find ourselves in the middle of the Paris 2024 Olympics, let's start with the Berlin Olympics of 1936 and the fact that they actually went ahead, because by then Hitler's dictatorship was self-evident. And of course the central question is why? If there's no penalty to not participating and no background in the SS type of anti-Semitism, why did in fact 85% participate? Until recently, Jews hadn't been eager to go to Palestine because Jews are mainly dedicated to commerce. And commerce remains quite profitable for them when they live amongst Christians. But if, on the contrary, all and only the Jews come together, you have an enormous gathering of swindlers while lacking those to be swindled.
Welcome to History for the Curious. I'm Menno Reisner, and I host the internationally renowned lecturer, dynamic historian, and tour guide, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Experience our history, confront dilemmas, and reveal the untold stories of 3,000 years of Jewish heritage, from Paris to Cairo, from the Russian Tsar to Maimonides, and from the Sinai Revelation to the French Revolution. Join the fastest growing Jewish history podcast in the world by subscribing to this channel and discovering the events that have shaped us into who we are today.
So would you say that the anti-Semitism that we see today as a result of what's happening post-October the 7th is also as a result of the seeds planted all those years ago?
It is definitely following the same lines. Just back then, the Jew was a pariah, and the modern-day equivalent is Israel. It is nowadays not a problem to say things, to write things publicly, to even legislate in international forums, such as the ICC, the ICJ, against Israel. It's not wrong to refuse to condemn the enemies of civilian Jews. It is not wrong to question the rights of Jews to exist at all, from the river to the sea. This is, yes, Christian ideology, and in fact it's Nazi ideology before they turned that into action. This is what they believed, this is what they wrote, this is what they were saying in their public speeches. And that means that when people are carrying out acts of anti-Semitism, not only can you go home without a guilty conscience, you're in fact standing up for the right causes. You're a good person. Because for 2,000 years, the teaching is you're a good Christian if you look down on the Jews. They killed God. And every Easter in every church, that would be read out. That extract from their New Testament that in every generation, his blood is upon the Jews everywhere. And, hey, walk outside of the church, you'll see pictures, sculptures of Jews drinking milk from the devil, of killing Christian children for their blood. And there are blood libels, by the way, well into the 20th century. Now, I will stress again, the church never advocated mass annihilation of the Jews, ever. But they portrayed the Jews as devil worshippers, as liars, as thieves, as murderers.
Were the Germans Christians?
Very much so. In 1939, 98% of Germans defined themselves as Christians. 1% of the remaining are Jews. Which means that the killers of Jews and all their collaborators identified themselves as Christians. And take it a stage further. Priests gave confessions to Germans in Eastern Europe where Jews were being murdered, the people from the police battalion that we just mentioned. Which means that all those involved in killing Jews in mass graves, after a week's work, they would come to church on Sunday, out there in Eastern Europe. What did the priests say to them? And the priests knew because they were accompanying these battalions. So Christian to Christian, how did they deal with the behavior of ordinary Germans who were shooting children at close range into ditches? Christianity is the backdrop. It is the foundation of how Jews were viewed by their neighbors, definitely how they were portrayed to their neighbors. And now we have to understand, what did the church do and say during the Holocaust years? How did they respond?
I mean, did they even know the extent of what was going on? Is there evidence that they knew?
Okay, let's look at it. Let's start with the Pope. He is the leader of 350 million Catholics in Europe's largest institution. For most of the war, he remains absolutely silent while German atrocities are committed. He refused all pleas for help on the grounds of neutrality, to avoid conflict with the Nazis. Direct orders went to the Vatican newspaper not to write about German atrocities. That meant never saying a word in public to explicitly denounce the SS massacres. And this is even, as we will see, when Jews were being rounded up right outside the Vatican walls, as they were in 1943, and put on trains from there to Auschwitz.
Did Hitler have a relationship with the Pope?
So he comes to power, it does, in 1933. Within a few weeks, he signed a Reich Concordat with the Catholic bishops. In fact, on July 8, 1933. It was the first treaty he signed with a foreign power, and it gives him, much needed international prestige. And the price that he demanded for signing this was high. He wanted the Catholic Church to completely withdraw from politics, which means that they had a political center party, which was anti-fascist. That was his target. Bismarck in the 19th century had tried and failed. Hitler made that a key demand, and the Vatican acquiesced, basically legitimizing Hitler's seizure of power and his hold over the parliament. This is in 1933. Hitler is weak at the time, and the church is in no danger. And Pacelli, who becomes the future Pope Pius XII in 1939, but in 1933 he was the Vatican Secretary of State, pledged the German Church's loyalty to the Nazi leadership. Catholic bishops, at the behest of the Pope, swore an oath of allegiance to the Nazi state.
But what are they getting from it? Surely it's only Hitler's gaining from this.
The Church from it. They were left alone in religious and cultural spheres at a time where trade unions were banned. And this accord is a higher level one between Nazi Germany and the Vatican. There are photos of it, it's in all the newspapers, and it would be ratified by the future Pope at a formal ceremony in Rome. Now, having said that, in October 1939, weeks after the outbreak of World War II, the Pope condemned the Nazi movement for their attacks against innocents. Who were these innocents? The Poles. This is Poland, not the Jews. For the next 4.5 years, as over 5 million would be murdered, he would say nothing to explicitly condemn or criticize.
But back to my question, how do we know that he knew?
Okay, well, first of all, it's rather difficult to make the claim that he didn't know anything when he had, archbishops, he had priests in the thousands in every single one of these occupied countries in Europe. But let's not speculate, let's look at facts. Throughout the Holocaust, he was besieged with cries for help on behalf of the Jews. Let's do this chronologically. Rabbi Herzog, chief rabbi of Palestine as it was at the time, asked the papal secretary of state, Cardinal Maglione, to intercede to keep Jews in Lithuania from being deported. The papacy did nothing. Conrad von Preysing, Bishop of Berlin, wrote to the Pope in January 1941, "Your Holiness is certainly informed about the situation of the Jews in Germany and the neighbouring countries. I wish to mention that I have been asked both from the Catholic and Protestant side if the Holy See could not do something on this subject in favour of these unfortunates." The letter was a direct appeal to the Pope himself, no intermediaries, no response. October 41, the assistant head of the US delegation to the Vatican, a guy called Harold Tittman, asked the Pope to condemn the atrocities. The response, the Holy See wanted to remain neutral. In 1942, the Slovakian chargé d'affaires, a position which is under the supervision of the Pope, reported to Rome that Slovak Jews were being systematically deported and sent to death camps. And September 18, 1942, a church official, in fact the future Pope Paul VI, wrote, "The massacres of the Jews reach frightening proportion and forms." Yet, in that same month, when the head of the US representatives to the Vatican, Myron Taylor, sent a report with details of the massacres in Warsaw and other places, and warned the Pope that his silence was endangering his moral prestige, now the Vatican is under pressure. The response was, it's impossible to verify rumors about crimes committed against the Jews, and Cardinal Angelo della Acqua, who worked for the Pope, said that the information in the Jewish Agency report needed to be verified, because the Jews, and I quote, tend to easily exaggerate. So they did nothing. I haven't finished. It was becoming harder to deny any knowledge. In late August 42, a month earlier, after more than 200,000 Ukrainian Jews had been killed, the Ukrainian Metropolitan Archbishop wrote a long letter to the Pope, a compelling, basically eyewitness account of the mass murder of the Jews in Lvov. The Pope replied by quoting verses from Psalms and advising him to bear adversity with serene patience. And in this case, this Della Acqua again, he questions the contents, not because now the Jews have created the report, but Eastern Catholics are not an example of reliability, so they did nothing. In actual fact, Robert Wistrich notes that by the end of 1942, the Vatican was amongst the best informed institutions in all of Europe about the Holocaust, except perhaps for the Germans themselves or British intelligence. Few people were more aware of the local details and the larger picture. They are the only pre-war institution in all of Europe still intact during the war. So now, finally in December 42, the United States receives a report on the mass murder of the Jews from the Polish government in exile, and on December 17th, the Soviet Union, the United States and Britain issued a joint statement condemning the German extermination of the Jews and stated that there would be retribution for the perpetrators of Jewish murders. The Vatican did not agree to sign. Instead, a week later, the Pope issued a Christmas message referring to hundreds of thousands of people who'd been killed. He never mentioned the Jews. We will get back to this next week. Meanwhile, US Catholic bishops released a statement which, unlike the Pope's remarks, explicitly mentions the Jews. And they wrote, "There has been a premeditated and systematic extermination of the peoples of this nation. We feel a deep sense of revulsion against the cruel indignities heaped upon the Jews in conquered countries and upon defenseless peoples not of our faith. Deeply moved by the arrest and maltreatment of the Jews, we cannot stifle the cry of conscience. In the name of humanity and Christian principles, our voice is raised."
So did that not create a pressure on the Pope to say something?
So now the papacy said they are unable to denounce particular atrocities and not denounce, let's say, the Soviet atrocities, even though the Allies felt they could. Although the Pope did speak generally against the extermination campaign as early as 1940. After the death toll of Polish civilians was estimated at 15,000, the Pope said in a broadcast, and I quote, "The horror and inexcusable excesses committed on a helpless and a homeless people have been established by the unimpeachable testimony of eyewitnesses." And then things came closer to home, much closer. On October 16, 1943, the Nazis arrested 1,259 Jews in Rome, most of whom were women and children. The German ambassador to the Holy See, von Weizsäcker, wrote to Berlin that the Pope, although he's being pressed by groups, has not allowed himself any expression of disapproval against the deportations, even though it occurred under his very windows. The Jews were held for 2 days in a military complex close to the Vatican. The Pope did lobby on behalf of some of the arrested Jews, which people sometimes have heard of. Which arrested Jews? Those who'd been converted to Christianity. And the Germans, in fact, gave the Vatican permission to send an envoy to the barracks where all these Jews are being held, and he found within the group people who'd already been baptized or confirmed or celebrated a church wedding, and the Vatican asked the German ambassador to intervene. 250 people who the church determined were Catholics were not deported. The rest of the Jews were taken to Auschwitz, 811 were gassed on arrival, and only 16 out of the whole group survived the war.
Hard to believe this happened only 80 years ago. This sounds like history repeating itself.
What is much harder to believe, and we'll talk more about this next week, is the amount of denial that has arisen about the Pope's record.
You mean until today?
Until today. In December 43, after all of this has happened, Vatican officials discussed, should the Pope say something about the deportation of Rome's Jews? Too late to save them, but should they say something? Once again, Dell'Acqua recommended that the Vatican make a general statement to the German ambassador, but that he should not aggravate the already grave situation of the Jews. But Dell'Acqua suggested that the Jews should be told to stop complaining about their treatment, and I quote, "One should let the Jewish signori know that they should speak a little less and act with greater